Hello, hello. Welcome to Rachel Paints Poorly. My name is Rachel and I paint poorly. Today I'm going to be painting Piet Mondrian's composition 1938 or Place de la Concorde 1938 to 1943, originally painted in 1938 to 1943. But before we get to that, I'd like to bid a fond farewell to my former lighting rig. I received a new setup for Christmas for some reason, and so will be retiring the old one. But remember, while today it is me, we all shall fall. Godspeed, my friend. But yeah, Piet Mondrian. So who was he, and how did we get to Place de la Concorde 1938 to 1943? On March 7th, 1872, Pieter Cornelis Mondriaan, with 2 A's, was born to an art teacher father, after whom he was named, and Johanna Christina Mondrian. The family lived in Amersfoort, in a house next to the school where the elder Pieter was the headmaster. Encouraged by his father, Piet's natural artistic talent was improved by taking drawing lessons and by painting with his uncle. In 1890, his first exhibition was at The Hague in the Here, I'm not saying it, where he received positive reviews. Piet's gradual change to abstraction is notable as early as 1897, when he was first introduced to theosophy. Oxford Dictionary defines theosophy as, quote, any of a number of philosophies maintaining that a knowledge of God may be achieved through spiritual ecstasy, direct intuition, or special individual relations, especially the movement founded in 1875 as a Theosophical Society by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, end quote. In response, Piet began shifting away from an academic interpretation of realism in art, instead focusing on experimenting with his compositions and injecting symbolism through the use of vivid colors. He was also drawn to landscapes, finding elements of abstraction in the horizontal linear perspective of rivers and ditches, and vertical planes of houses and windmills. After 1898, Piet began developing his own style. This wasn't entirely for the best. His application that year for the prestigious Prix de Rome competition was rejected on account of his poor drawing from the nude. His second attempt, this time in 1901, was also unsuccessful. Nevertheless, he continued to paint, drawing inspirations from landscapes that ranged from the traditional Dutch style to the work of the late Vincent van Gogh, whose paintings were beginning to gain traction in the art world. The idea of copying other paintings appealed to Piet's worldview. Like the German Romantics, he doubted whether or not art could accurately depict experience, eventually concluding that painting merely copied other paintings. But rather than being put off by this notion of inherent artificiality in art, Piet embraced it wholeheartedly. His landscapes at this time are quite artificial, especially in regards to color. After the unexpected death of his mother in 1909, Piet's work shifted away from the warmth of colorful landscapes to the coldness of abstract forms. In late 1911, Piet decided to move to Paris, to be in the same city as the man he considered the greatest painter of the age, Pablo Picasso. Upon his arrival in Paris, Piet abandoned his father's name, Pieter Cornelis Mondriaan, shortening it to Piet Mondrian. Making no effort to meet with Pablo Picasso or Georges Braque, he nonetheless began experimenting with their new art form, Cubism. In the earlier phase of Cubism, since coined analytical Cubism, color was unnecessary, and black lines featured throughout. Piet's Cubist works follow this, while gradually tending towards greater abstraction. He said, quote, I believe that it is possible, by means of horizontal and vertical lines, guided by a higher intuition and brought to harmony and rhythm, supplemented by lines in other directions or curved lines to arrive at a work of art which is as strong as it is true, end quote. His breakthrough occurred with the placement of abstract patterns across the canvas instead of in a recognizable configuration with a center and an upper and lower section. In 1914, Piet left Paris for the Netherlands to visit his sick father, but the outbreak of World War I prevented his return. Living near Amsterdam, his artistic output dwindled. No longer interested in Cubism, he instead engaged in deep conversations with fellow artists Bart van der Lek, Wilmos Huszar, and Theo van Doesburg. Both he and van Doesburg thought that avant-garde art had a place alongside radical modern architecture, and Piet sought to incorporate the unmoving stability of architecture into his work. He was especially taken with van Doesburg's design for a stained glass window, which he incorporated into his paintings. After his return to Paris in 1919, Piet's new direction in grid paintings had made him the most modern abstract painter in his field. This, however, came at a cost, in his growing dissatisfaction with his work, which he felt was becoming static in its lack of variety in scale, balance, and proportion. As pure abstraction in and of itself was no longer appealing, Piet began infusing his canvases with style as well. The blocks grew larger, and the colors used to fill them were bright and bold. Piet enclosed them with strong black lines, and the overall effect was one of spirals and outward motion. In 1920, Piet began working with pure red, blue, and yellow, tempered with white, black, and gray. And it was in this new spirit that Place de la Concorde, 1938 to 1943, came to be. And so, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Only now I become conscious that my work in black, white, and small colored planes has been merely drawing in oil color. In drawings, the lines are the most important form of expression. In painting, however, the lines are absorbed by the color planes. Piet Mondrian. Mondrian worked for months on a single painting, applying layers of paint and overpainting until he was satisfied with the results. He was also impatient and often used petroleum as a solvent to make the oil paints dry faster. While this makes for an interesting anecdote, it also creates a major headache for conservators, who must watch in agony as the paintings are not only very difficult to clean while simultaneously looking dirty, but also as the paint itself cracks and crumbles off the canvas. In 1920, he began exhibiting his paintings without frames, then went on to edge them in lined strips of white wood. By the late 1920s, he built white shadow boxes for them. After 1921, Piet began increasingly favoring areas of empty whiteness. This continued into the next decade, when he created lozenge composition with two lines in 1931 for the Hilversum Town Hall. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the people of Hilversum did not much care for their new painting and sold it to Amsterdam. The fine folks of Hilversum notwithstanding, by 1932 people had come to accept Piet's style. In honor of his 60th birthday, Amsterdam's Stedelijk Museum put on a major exhibition of his work. It seemed as if he had reached his ultimate art form. In 1933, however, in the creation of Composition with Yellow Lines, a gift to the museum in The Hague, he broke with his own rules by creating lines of bright yellow instead of the ubiquitous black. And the surprises kept on coming. Another work from the same period includes a double black line, in theory arising from Piet's meeting painter Marlowe Moss and adopting it from her style. The addition of another line adds a sense of whimsy and lightness to these works. In 1932, Piet had written to a friend, quote, "I am presently involved in new research into painting with double lines. Thus, in a sense, I do away with the black, which I find less and less pleasing." End quote. In 1938, with Paris under the threat of World War II, Piet left for London, where he remained until 1940. When an air raid shattered the windows of the apartment in which he resided. He then accepted an offer from American artist Harry Holzman to move to New York City. Already a fan of jazz, Piet became enamored by the boogie-woogie, a form of blues based around the piano, which was popular in New York in the late 1930s. In June of 1942, he began working on Victory Boogie Woogie. By October of 1943, he had fashioned the red, blue, yellow, light gray, and black lines out of tape, which he moved around on the canvas. Another piece, Broadway Boogie Woogie, was sold for $600, about $9,305 in 2021, the most he had ever been paid for a work during his lifetime. At the time of his death on February 1st, 1944, Victory Boogie Woogie was left unfinished. It was the only work consistently displayed in his studio, and Piet had been making drastic changes to it in the weeks before his death, continuing to push the boundaries and create new forms of abstraction. In January, he had told Holzman, quote, "The only thing left for me to do is paint it," end quote. Over 200 artists came to pay their respects, including Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, and Max Ernst. In 1932, Piet had written, quote, "I believe that at times such as these my modest efforts may be useful to mankind. I have shown how the new art has succeeded in bringing about pure relationships, and furthermore, how these can be created in day-to-day life," end quote. In response to the question, quote, "What would you like to express in your work?" end quote, Piet answered what any artist wants, quote, "Harmony by means of equivalence between lines, colors, and planes, but with clarity and strength," end quote. And there you have it, Place de la Concorde, 1938 to 1943. Thank you so much for watching. As always, thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to see future videos like this, and much more. Comment your thoughts, questions, suggestions down below, and feel free to follow me over on Instagram at Rachel Paints Poorly. Until next time, bye.